They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes it's written by the survivors. And no one, absolutely no one, survived an encounter with Ivar the Boneless and lived to tell a tale that didn't end in blood, terror, and nightmares. This is the story of a man who should never have lived. A crippled child who became the most feared Viking commander in history. A strategic genius who conquered kingdoms from a position where he could not even stand. This is not a story of heroism. This is a story of brilliance, brutality, and an unbreakable will that bent the entire medieval world to its knees. This is the legend of Ivar the Boneless. The year was 794 AD, 1 year after the legendary raid on Lindisfarne that announced the Viking Age to a terrified Europe. In the aftermath of Ragnar Lothbrok's triumphant return from England, something impossible happened in the Great Hall of Denmark. A child was born who would change the course of Viking history forever. But this birth brought not celebration, but horror. The baby boy came into the world twisted and broken. His bones were soft, fragile, unable to support his own weight. The midwives whispered that he would not survive the night. Viking society was brutal in its pragmatism. Weak children, especially those of noble birth who could never fight, were often exposed to the elements. Better a quick death than a lifetime of shame. But this was no ordinary child. This was the son of Ragnar Lothbrok, the most famous Viking alive, and his wife Aslaug, who claimed descent from the Valkyries themselves. Aslaug refused to let her son die. She held the infant close, staring down anyone who suggested otherwise. And Ragnar, seeing something in his son's eyes, something fierce and unbroken despite the broken body, made a decision that would echo through centuries. The child would live. They named him Ivar. And as he grew, defying every expectation of his survival, they added the name that would become legend, Ivar the Boneless. The exact nature of Ivar's condition has been debated by historians for over 1,000 years. Some chronicles describe him as unable to walk at all. Others suggest he could move, but with great difficulty. Modern scholars have proposed everything from brittle bone disease to a form of dwarfism. But whatever the medical reality, the historical truth is clear. Ivar was physically disabled in a society that valued physical strength above almost everything else. And yet, somehow, he not only survived, but thrived. From his earliest years, Ivar was different. While his brothers, Bjorn, Fitzurk, and Sigurd, trained with weapons and wrestled in the mud, Ivar watched. And as he watched, he learned. He couldn't match his brothers in physical combat, so he learned to think 3 moves ahead. He studied the Hnefatafl board game with an obsession that bordered on madness, mastering strategies that baffled grown warriors. He listened to the skalds sing of ancient battles, not for entertainment, but to analyze tactics, to understand why armies won or lost. His father, Ragnar, recognized something extraordinary in his disabled son. While others saw weakness, Ragnar saw a mind that processed information differently, that saw patterns others missed. He began bringing Ivar to councils, letting him observe negotiations and strategy sessions. The boy absorbed everything like a sponge soaking up water. But intelligence doesn't protect you from cruelty, and young Ivar faced it daily. His brothers, though they loved him, couldn't help but see him as lesser. Other children mocked him openly. Warriors whispered that the gods had cursed Ragnar's bloodline. Every slight, every dismissive look, every whispered insult, Ivar stored away in his memory like weapons in an arsenal. He would remember, and one day, he would make them all remember him. The turning point came when Ivar was 12 years old. A visiting jarl, drunk on mead and arrogant beyond measure, made the fatal mistake of mocking Ivar in front of the entire hall. He called the boy a cripple, a burden, an embarrassment to the great Ragnar Lothbrok. He suggested that Ivar should have been left to die as an infant, that he served no purpose but to shame his family. The hall fell silent. Ragnar's hand moved toward his axe. But before anyone could act, Ivar spoke. His voice was calm, almost pleasant, as he posed a riddle to the Jarl. A complex puzzle involving strategy and military tactics. The Jarl, confident in his own cunning, accepted the challenge. Within minutes, Ivar had made him look like a fool. The Jarl's answers were obvious and wrong. Ivar's logic was unassailable. And when the boy was finished, he looked at the humiliated warrior and said, in a voice that carried through the hall, "You have the use of your legs, and yet you cannot walk through a simple problem. I have no legs, and yet I can run circles around your mind. Tell me, who is truly crippled here?" The hall erupted in laughter. The Jarl's face turned purple with rage, but there was nothing he could do. To attack a child would be dishonorable. To continue arguing would only deepen his humiliation. He left the hall in shame, and from that day forward, no one mocked Ivar the Boneless to his face ever again. As Ivar entered his teenage years, his reputation began to spread beyond Denmark. He had become his father's primary strategic advisor, despite being younger than his brothers. When Ragnar planned raids, it was Ivar who suggested the targets, who calculated the risks, who predicted enemy responses. And increasingly, he was right. Unnervingly right. It was as if he could see into the future, anticipate moves before they were made. But Ivar wanted more than to be an advisor. He wanted to lead. He wanted to prove that a man didn't need working legs to be a warrior. And so, he designed something that would become his trademark. A war chariot. Not the light ceremonial chariots of old, but a heavy, reinforced platform that could be pulled by horses or pushed by warriors. From this mobile command center, equipped with weapons and protected by shields, Ivar could observe the battlefield, direct troops, and even fight if necessary. It was unconventional, strange, and absolutely terrifying to those who faced it. His first real test came when he was 17. A rival clan had been raiding Danish settlements, growing bold enough to threaten Ragnar's territory. Ragnar, wanting to test his son's abilities, gave Ivar command of a small force to drive them off. His brothers protested. This was supposed to be Bjorn's command, but Ragnar insisted. Ivar would lead, and his brothers would follow his orders. The raid should have been straightforward. Track the raiders, engage them in battle, drive them back to their own territory. But Ivar didn't do straightforward. He studied the enemy's pattern of attacks, predicted their next target, and arrived there 3 days before they did. He had his men prepare an ambush so elaborate, so perfectly timed, that when the enemy arrived, they walked into a massacre. Not a single one of Ivar's warriors died. The enemy was annihilated. When they returned home, Ivar's brothers were silent. They had witnessed something they didn't fully understand. Their crippled younger brother had just conducted a military operation with a precision and brutality that would have impressed veteran commanders. And Ivar, sitting in his chariot, had directed it all without even drawing a weapon himself. Ragnar looked at his son and saw the future. This was the child who would carry on his legacy. Not Bjorn with his strength, not Hvitserk with his courage, not Sigurd with his charm. Ivar, the broken one. The one no one expected. The one everyone had underestimated. And in that moment, Ragnar knew that his enemies were going to learn a terrible lesson about underestimating Ivar the Boneless. But fate had other plans. Before Ivar could prove himself further, news arrived that would change everything. Ragnar Lothbrok, in a moment of pride or perhaps premonition of his own end, had assembled a small fleet for one final raid on England. Against all advice, ignoring the pleas of his family, the legendary Viking had sailed west with barely 2 ships and a handful of men. And he had never returned. The rumors came first, whispered by traders and travelers. Then confirmation arrived from a surviving warrior who had escaped the disaster. Ragnar had been captured by King Ella of Northumbria. He had been thrown into a pit of venomous serpents. And as he died, bitten again and again by snakes, Ragnar Lothbrok had sung his death song. His final words were not a cry for mercy or a curse on his enemies. They were a prophecy. How the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. When Ivar heard the news, something inside him broke. Or perhaps, something was finally unleashed. The young man who had spent his entire life proving he was more than his disability now had a purpose that transcended everything else. Vengeance. Not hot-blooded emotional vengeance. Cold, calculated, absolute vengeance. King Ella had killed Ragnar Lothbrok. King Ella would pay. England would pay. And the payment would be in blood, measured in rivers. Ivar called his brothers together. Bjorn, the eldest, strong and brave. Fitzurk, loyal and fierce. Sigurd, charming and impulsive. And Halfdan and Ubi, sons from Ragnar's earlier marriages. They were all grief-stricken, all angry, all ready to sail to England and kill everyone responsible. But Ivar told them to wait. Grief and anger were not enough. They needed an army, not a raiding party, not a large war band, an army unlike anything the Vikings had ever assembled, an army so massive that England would tremble at the sight of it. Over the next months, Ivar traveled throughout Scandinavia. Moving from his chariot to ships to wherever he needed to be, he spoke to jarls, to earls, to every warrior who had ever respected Ragnar Lothbrok. And he didn't just ask them to avenge his father, he offered them something more. Glory, conquest, riches beyond imagination, land in England for those who wanted it. He painted a vision of a Viking England, of kingdoms brought to heel, of a new Norse empire across the sea. His brothers helped recruit. His father's reputation opened doors. But it was Ivar's mind that sealed the deal. He showed the Jarls maps of England. He explained the political situation, the rivalries between kingdoms, the weaknesses in their defenses. He demonstrated how a coordinated campaign could succeed where random raids had failed. He made them see what he saw: opportunity. By the spring of 865 AD, Ivar had done the impossible. He had assembled the great Heathen army. The historical records differ on exact numbers, but conservative estimates suggest at least 3,000 warriors, possibly many more. To put that in perspective, most Viking raids involved 30 to 100 men. 3,000 Vikings, united under a single purpose, was an invasion force that could challenge entire kingdoms. And Ivar, at just 21 years old, unable to walk without assistance, had organized it all. The fleet that sailed from Denmark that summer was the largest Viking force ever seen. Hundreds of longships filled the horizon, their sails like a forest on the water. And at the center of the fleet, on the largest ship, sitting in his war chariot, was Ivar the Boneless. The boy who should have died was about to bring death to an entire nation. They landed in East Anglia in the fall of 865 AD. King Edmund of East Anglia, terrified by the size of the Viking force, immediately negotiated for peace. In exchange for supplies and horses, the Vikings would move on and not ravage his kingdom. Ivar accepted, not out of mercy, but because he needed those horses. His army wasn't here to raid coastal settlements. They were here to conquer. The great Heathen army moved north, and with every mile they traveled, more scouts brought back information. Information that Ivar analyzed, cataloged, and used to refine his strategy. England was divided into several kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. They were often at war with each other, too focused on their own petty conflicts to unite against a common enemy. This was exactly what Ivar had counted on. In November 866, the Vikings arrived at York, the capital of Northumbria. The city was one of the largest in England, heavily fortified, seemingly impregnable. And it was here that King Ella ruled, the man who had killed Ragnar Lothbrok. The brothers wanted to attack immediately, storm the walls, find Ella, and make him pay. But Ivar stopped them. Attacking a fortified city head-on was suicide. Instead, he waited. Northumbria was in the middle of a civil war. King Ella was fighting with a rival claimant, Osbert, for control of the kingdom. The two couldn't even agree to unite against the Viking threat. Ivar sent word to both men separately, suggesting he might be willing to negotiate, to play one against the other. While they argued over how to respond, Ivar studied the city's defenses, identified the weakest points, learned the guard rotation schedules from bribes and spies. On November 21st, during a heavy rainstorm when visibility was poor and guards were seeking shelter, the Vikings struck. Not a massive frontal assault, but multiple coordinated breaches at the weakest points. By the time the defenders realized what was happening, Vikings were pouring through the streets. The city fell in hours. Ella and Osbert, realizing too late they needed to work together, gathered their forces for a desperate counterattack. The battle outside York's walls was brutal. The Northumbrian army fought with the courage of men defending their homes. But they were facing the great Heathen army, led by commanders who had been planning this moment for months. Ivar positioned his forces perfectly, using the terrain to funnel the enemy into killing zones. His brothers led the charges that broke the enemy lines. And when it was over, both Ella and Osbert lay among the dead and captured. What happened next became one of the most infamous moments in Viking history. Ivar had King Ella brought before him, bound and helpless. The king who had thrown Ragnar Lothbrok into a pit of snakes now faced Ragnar's crippled son. Ella, perhaps hoping for a warrior's death, met Ivar's gaze with defiance. And Ivar smiled. A cold, terrible smile that promised something far worse than a quick death. The execution method Ivar chose was called the Blood Eagle. It was one of the most brutal execution techniques in human history, reserved for the most hated enemies. The victim's ribs would be cut from the spine and pulled outward, resembling eagle wings. The lungs would be pulled through the opening. Whether this was done while the victim was still alive is debated by historians. But the sagas insist that Ella lived through the ordeal, unable to scream because to do so would shame him before the gods. Whether the Blood Eagle actually happened or was a later embellishment is unclear. But what is certain is that Ella died in agony, that his death was designed to send a message, and that Ivar made sure everyone in England heard that message. This was what happened to those who harmed the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. With Northumbria conquered, Ivar revealed his true genius. He didn't just raid and leave. He established Viking control over York, turning it into a permanent base. He installed a puppet king who would rule in name while Vikings held real power. He began distributing land to his warriors, giving them reason to stay and defend their new holdings. And then, while his enemies were still reeling, he moved south. Over the next 5 years, from 866 to 871, Ivar and the great Heathen army rampaged through England with a systematic efficiency that was unprecedented. They conquered Mercia, forcing its king to become a vassal. They returned to East Anglia, and when King Edmund refused to renounce Christianity, Ivar had him killed and his kingdom absorbed. Only Wessex, under the leadership of a young king named Alfred, managed to resist effectively. But what made Ivar truly dangerous wasn't just his military victories. It was his political genius. He understood that conquest meant nothing if you couldn't hold the territory. So he created an administrative system, placing loyal men in key positions, establishing trade relationships, ensuring the conquered territories remained productive and valuable. He transformed Viking raiders into Viking rulers. His brothers began to resent his dominance. Bjorn had expected to lead once Ella was avenged, but Ivar showed no signs of stepping aside. Sigurd grew jealous of Ivar's influence and made the fatal mistake of mocking his brother in front of the army, making crude jokes about Ivar's disability. Ivar listened in silence. Then, in front of everyone, he calmly picked up a throwing axe and hurled it at Sigurd with devastating accuracy. His brother died instantly, and Ivar looked at the assembled warriors with a simple message. Anyone else want to question his authority? The army stayed loyal, not out of love, but out of respect and fear. Ivar had proven he could lead them to victory and wealth. And if crossing him meant death, well, that was clear enough. In 870 AD, Ivar made a decision that shocked everyone. He announced he was leaving England. Not retreating, not giving up his conquests, but delegating command to his brothers while he pursued an even more ambitious goal. He was going to conquer Ireland. Ireland at the time was divided into dozens of small kingdoms, constantly warring with each other. Viking settlements already existed there, but they were small, isolated, defensive. Ivar arrived with a fleet and a plan to unite these settlements into a Viking kingdom. Within 2 years, he had captured Dublin, turned it into a Viking stronghold, and established himself as king. But his health was failing. The same condition that had made his bones fragile in childhood was taking its toll. He was in constant pain, his body breaking down piece by piece. And yet, he continued to command, to plan, to build his kingdom. When messengers arrived from England with news and questions, Ivar would dictate responses, his mind still sharp even as his body deteriorated. In 873 AD, Ivar the Boneless died in Dublin. The sagas say he died of old age, which is remarkable considering his condition. He was not yet 40 years old, but for a man who should have died as an infant, he had lived multiple lifetimes. He had avenged his father, conquered kingdoms, and fundamentally changed the political map of Britain and Ireland. But his legacy was more than territorial conquest. Ivar had proven something that echoed through history. That true power comes not from physical strength, but from intelligence, planning, and unbreakable will. He had taken every disadvantage, every limitation, every reason the world gave him to fail, and he had transformed them into weapons. The boy who could not walk had brought an empire to its knees. The cripple had made kings tremble. And the son everyone expected to die had become immortal in legend. The great heathen army continued for years after Ivar's death, eventually establishing the Danelaw, a Viking-controlled territory covering much of England. Dublin remained a Viking stronghold for centuries. The political changes Ivar initiated shaped Britain and Ireland for generations. Kings would rise and fall, but the world Ivar helped create endured. Modern historians debate many aspects of Ivar's story. How disabled was he really? Did the Blood Eagle actually happen? How much of his reputation was earned and how much was propaganda? But the core facts remain undeniable. A young man with a severe physical disability became one of the most successful military commanders of the Viking Age. He organized the largest Viking invasion force in history. He conquered kingdoms that had stood for centuries. And he did it all from a position where he couldn't even stand. Ivar the Boneless was not a hero in the traditional sense. His methods were brutal, his vengeance absolute, his mercy non-existent. But he was undeniably brilliant, undeniably effective, and undeniably one of the most remarkable figures in medieval history. In an age where physical prowess was everything, he proved that the mind could be the most powerful weapon of all. His story asks uncomfortable questions about our assumptions, about who we consider strong and who we consider weak, about what true power really means, about the price of vengeance and the cost of ambition, and about what a human being can accomplish when they refuse to accept the limitations the world tries to impose on them. From the broken infant no one expected to survive to the legendary commander who brought kingdoms to heel, Ivar the Boneless lived a life that defied every expectation. He took a body that wouldn't work and a world that wouldn't accept him, and he bent them both to his will. He couldn't walk, but he marched across history. He couldn't stand, but he stood above kings, and he couldn't be broken no matter how hard the world tried. This was Ivar the Boneless, disabled, deadly, unstoppable, legend. And his story reminds us that the most dangerous enemies are not the ones with the biggest swords, but the ones with the sharpest minds. That true strength comes not from muscles, but from will. And that sometimes, the people the world writes off as broken are the ones who will break the world itself. If you enjoyed this epic saga of the Viking who redefined what strength means, make sure to subscribe to Viking Valhalla for more untold stories of the greatest warriors history has ever known. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another legendary tale. Which Viking legend should we explore next? Bjorn Ironside's voyages to the Mediterranean? Lagertha the Shield Maiden's battles? Harald Hardrada's quest for the throne? Your voice shapes our sagas. Until next time, may your mind be sharp and your will unbreakable. Skål.